Good evening. Welcome to tonight's scary bedtime story to help you fall asleep. Please comment below and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. When you're a journalist, particularly one with an appetite for unconventional narratives, you learn to embrace life's unpredictability. So when my editor proposed an article on self-exiled hermits dwelling in the Appalachian highlands, I was immediately captivated. The prospect of interviewing individuals who had deliberately turned their backs on civilization intrigued me profoundly. Who were these people? What catalysts drove them to abandon modern existence? These questions burned in my mind, demanding answers. I secured a rustic lodge near the mountain's base, the sort of picturesque dwelling that belongs on vintage postcards. Towering hemlocks framed a weathered timber structure, with delicate plumes of smoke curling from the stone chimney. The accommodation showed signs of age but possessed undeniable character, and its isolation proved ideal for my assignment. My initial days were productive, hiking verdant trails, documenting observations, and arranging conversations. Most recluses I encountered proved surprisingly receptive. They had constructed their shelters, cultivated sustenance, and appeared content in their chosen isolation. Then I encountered Marshall. For confidentiality, I've altered his name, but his essence remains unchanged. Marshall resided approximately 2 miles up a rugged path, far deeper into the wilderness than any other subject I'd interviewed. His dwelling was an improvised shanty held together with salvaged materials and weatherproof tarps. He was wiry, with an unkempt beard and penetrating eyes that seemed to bore directly through you. Initially suspicious, he interrogated my motives for seeking him out, but eventually relented to conversation. The interview proved deeply disquieting. Marshall spoke in fractured, disjointed sentences, his words saturated with paranoia. "People invariably want to take," he muttered, gaze fixed somewhere beyond the surrounding pines. "They arrive with their recording devices, their invasive inquiries. They take and depart, never contemplating what they leave behind." I attempted to redirect our discussion toward his lifestyle choices, but he continuously circled back to outsiders and their alleged destruction of everything they contacted. By the time I departed, twilight was descending, and the trail was darkening ominously. Marshall observed my exit wordlessly, his silhouette merging with the deepening forest shadows. 2 days later, I returned to my lodge after an extensive day of interviews to discover a note fastened to the entrance door. The parchment appeared weathered, the message scrawled in irregular, heavy lettering: "Depart or face consequences." Tension constricted my stomach as I surveyed the clearing. Was this some juvenile prank? Perhaps one of the hermits resented my inquiries. Marshall immediately entered my thoughts, but I dismissed the suspicion. The note could have originated from anyone. I discarded it into the fireplace and resolved not to dwell on the incident. After all, the lodge was secure, and I hadn't observed anyone on the trail. That evening, while organizing interview notes, I detected something outside. Initially just a branch snapping, possibly wildlife. But then came unmistakable footsteps slowly crunching across frost-covered terrain. I extinguished the lamp and sat motionless in darkness, straining to discern additional sounds. The footsteps halted. I waited, heart pounding, but the silence persisted. Eventually, I convinced myself it was merely my imagination and retired for the night. By morning, I noticed something disturbing: deep gouges near the door lock that hadn't existed previously. It felt as though all oxygen had been forcibly expelled from my lungs. Whoever left the note hadn't merely intended intimidation. They had attempted entry. I contacted the rental agency, but they dismissed my concerns, suggesting local adolescents occasionally played pranks on tourists. Their explanation rang hollow, so I purchased a heavy-duty padlock and reinforced the entrance myself. That night, the noises returned. I peered through the window, but the clearing appeared vacant. Just as I prepared to turn away, movement caught my attention. A silhouette, tall and angular, slipping between trees, vanishing before I could properly observe it. I remained vigilant until dawn, nerves frayed beyond measure. When daylight finally broke, I ventured outside to discover fresh bootprints encircling the lodge. They were deeply impressed, as though their creator wanted to ensure I noticed their presence. By the 5th night, I reached my psychological limit. I maintained my phone charging nearby, kept a flashlight accessible, and wedged a chair beneath the doorknob for additional security. Concentration proved impossible. The slightest breeze or subtle cabin noise triggered my hypervigilance. Around midnight, I heard a sharp metallic scraping at the entrance, metal against metal, someone manipulating the lock. My breath caught as the door handle jiggled, followed by a low, guttural chuckle. I reached for my phone, preparing to dial emergency services, when a tremendous impact shook the bedroom window. The sound reverberated through the lodge like a gunshot, but it wasn't the door. It came from the bedroom window, so forceful the entire pane rattled as though on the verge of shattering. I remained frozen. Then it repeated, bang, followed by that same unsettling laugh, but now it sounded nearer, as though the intruder was enjoying himself immensely. He uttered no words, nothing but the hammering, the laughter, and the oppressive silence between these disturbances. That silence proved most terrifying. It felt calculated, as though he were observing me, anticipating my next move. I wasn't a person to him, merely prey, something to torment for entertainment. I sat clutching the flashlight so tightly my fingers ached, desperately attempting to detect any movement. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, retreating into the forest. The following morning, I hastily packed everything, haphazardly tossing possessions into my vehicle without concern for organization. I didn't even notify the rental agency. I simply needed to escape. Upon reaching the nearest township, I stopped at a local diner to compose myself. The waitress, noticing my disheveled condition, inquired about my welfare. I recounted the cabin incidents. Her complexion paled instantly. "Was it near Whispering Pines Creek?" she asked. "Locals avoid that area," she continued. "There's a hermit there, a malevolent one. He's notorious for intimidating hikers and campers. They say he despises outsiders." I reported everything to authorities, but they appeared unconcerned. "Hermits behave that way," one officer remarked dismissively. "They resent privacy intrusions." Since then, I've rejected assignments involving isolated locations. The Appalachians may possess breathtaking beauty, but for me, they'll forever be haunted by memories of Marshall and the chilling realization that some individuals will resort to terrifying measures to protect their solitude. After a decade ensnared in the relentless cycle of international conferences, executive boardrooms, and unforgiving deadlines, the concept of genuine seclusion seemed like an unattainable fantasy. But my transition from corporate strategist to independent writer demanded precisely that tranquility to recalibrate my internal compass. My existence had devolved into an endless whirlwind of itineraries and obligations, leaving me desperate to disconnect, in the most literal sense. That's what led me to lease a weathered cottage in the Green Mountains last October. The listing fulfilled every requirement: rustic elegance, a secluded workspace, and complete isolation. The absence of cellular reception didn't concern me. I wasn't seeking to scroll mindlessly through electronic communications or digital feeds. The cabin possessed a landline for emergencies, which seemed adequate. I envisioned crisp mornings savoring freshly brewed coffee, productive afternoons immersed in writing, and peaceful evenings beneath a celestial canopy of stars. Reality, however, proved more complicated than this idyllic vision. The journey there was breathtaking. Early autumn had transformed the mountains into a tapestry of crimson, amber, and gold, while the crystalline air provided welcome relief from metropolitan humidity. When I navigated the winding gravel path to the driveway, I immediately fell under the cottage's spell. The structure was modest but enchanting, with silvered cedar siding and flower boxes suspended beneath mullioned windows. The interior matched the exterior's charm. A cast-iron wood stove occupied one corner. An antique writing desk overlooked the forest through expansive windows, and there was even a cozy reading alcove piled with plush cushions. I arranged my laptop, unpacked my notebooks, and immersed myself in creative work. The initial days passed in blissful tranquility. I wrote extensively, paused for leisurely exploration of nearby wilderness trails, and spent evenings absorbed in literature beside crackling flames. The cottage creaked and settled in the way all venerable structures do, a sound I found oddly reassuring. Then came the tempest. On the third evening, a violent storm descended, battering the cottage with torrential rain and howling gales. I decided to retire early, shutting down my computer and curling up with chamomile tea. The storm's ferocity made the cottage feel increasingly confining, and I reluctantly acknowledged that the isolation was beginning to weigh heavily. Just as drowsiness overtook me, the landline's shrill ring pierced the atmosphere. The unexpected sound startled me. I hadn't anticipated communication, and the intrusion felt strangely discordant in this remote sanctuary. I hesitated, allowing it to ring twice before answering. "Hello?" My voice reflected uncertainty. No response greeted me, only static interference. "Hello?" I attempted again. The static faded, followed by absolute silence as the connection terminated. I stared at the receiver momentarily before replacing it. Perhaps a misdirected call or a storm-related technical malfunction, I reasoned. Nevertheless, it left me with a vague sense of disquiet. The storm dissipated by sunrise, leaving behind a sodden, overcast landscape. I ventured outside with steaming coffee, savoring the earthy fragrance of rain-drenched foliage. As I approached my vehicle to retrieve items from the trunk, something caught my peripheral vision. The telephone line. It dangled limply from the cottage wall, severed and disconnected from the utility pole. I approached for closer inspection, puzzled by the cleanly cut edges. This wasn't storm damage. It appeared deliberately executed. If the line had been severed, how had the telephone functioned last night? I attempted to rationalize the situation. Perhaps the line had been damaged during the storm. But the edges weren't frayed or torn. They were precise, as though deliberately cut. Nausea swept through me as I contemplated the implications. That evening, as twilight descended below the tree line, I instructed myself to disregard the incident. I prepared dinner, played instrumental music, and attempted to lose myself in creative writing. Yet the cottage felt transformed, as though it no longer belonged exclusively to me. While washing dishes, I noticed something disturbing through the kitchen window. Muddy footprints trailing across the porch, leading directly to the window adjacent to my writing desk. The same window where I'd spent countless hours working. I stood paralyzed, staring at the evidence. They hadn't existed earlier in the day. Someone had approached while I was cooking. I verified every lock, selected the largest kitchen knife available, and retreated to the bedroom. Sleep eluded me. I sat vigilant on the bed, knife within reach on the nightstand, flinching at every subtle sound. Around midnight, a forceful knock shattered the silence. This wasn't casual rapping. It resonated throughout the cottage with deliberate intensity. My pulse accelerated as I cautiously approached the entrance, knife firmly gripped. "Who's there?" I called, my voice betraying my apprehension. No response, just wind rattling the windows. The knock repeated, more forcefully than before. I peered through the peephole but discerned only darkness. My hands trembled while I rechecked the locks and retreated from the door. The cottage suddenly felt claustrophobic, its walls too restrictive, its windows too vulnerable. I longed desperately for daybreak. The moment initial light fractured through the trees, I hastily packed belongings and loaded them into my vehicle. My hands quivered as I secured the cottage one final time and navigated down the gravel path. At the driveway's end stood a utility truck. A worker in protective headgear was examining the severed telephone line. "Excuse me," I called, exiting my vehicle. "Did the storm cause that damage?" He scrutinized the severed line, shaking his head. "Negative, ma'am," he replied, indicating the clean incision. "This has been deliberately cut." An icy sensation permeated my body. He studied my expression, then inquired slowly, "Did you notice anything unusual last night? Footprints, noises, anything suspicious?" I hesitated, pulse quickening as I recalled the muddy impressions on the porch and the mysterious knocking. "Yes," I admitted reluctantly. "There were footprints leading to the window and some knocking disturbances." "You should depart immediately," he advised emphatically. "We've received reports in this vicinity. Criminals severing telephone lines to disable landlines, ensuring residents cannot summon assistance. Then they infiltrate isolated residences, even when occupied. They typically confine inhabitants in bathrooms while searching for valuables." I stared at him, the gravity of his words penetrating my consciousness. "But they didn't attempt entry," I protested, more to comfort myself than challenge his assessment. He nodded but appeared unconvinced. "You were fortunate, exceptionally so. But if they were conducting reconnaissance, They'll likely return. I wouldn't remain to discover their intentions. I expressed gratitude and wasted no time. I drove directly to the nearest town, heart pounding throughout the journey. Upon reaching safety, I contacted the property owner and local authorities, reporting all details. The owner refunded my reservation and promised to coordinate with law enforcement. I still reflect on that cottage, the severed line, and the muffled knocking. I've grown more cautious, prioritizing security over seclusion. Solitude, as I discovered, sometimes harbors greater dangers than peace. After decades rushing into blazing structures, I learned to cherish tranquility with newfound appreciation. That yearning for serenity drew me towards secluded destinations following my retirement from firefighting service. The Smoky Mountains had lingered on my aspirational list for years, so in December 2022, I finally transformed intention into reality. I secured a remote cabin nestled within the forest's embrace. The dwelling embodied every expectation: a modest central room featuring a traditional wood-burning hearth, compact kitchenette, comfortable sleeping quarters, and wraparound veranda overlooking the dense canopy below. No cellular connectivity, no internet accessibility, nothing but nature's symphony as accompaniment. Absolute perfection. An overwhelming sense of contentment enveloped me. My routine quickly established itself, awakening with sunrise, brewing robust coffee, and embarking on invigorating morning excursions. The pathways remained deserted. My sole companions were the percussive crunch of desiccated foliage underfoot and the distant murmur of cascading water. Evenings found me curled beside crackling flames, literary volume in hand, basking in the hearth's radiant warmth. It represented precisely the solitude that rejuvenates, rather than depletes the spirit. The nocturnal darkness transcended anything previously experienced. In the absence of urban illumination, only celestial bodies and lunar glow provided faint illumination. The beauty inspired awe, yet carried subtle undertones of vulnerability, an acute awareness of my profound isolation from humanity. During one particular night, a delicate tapping sound roused me from slumber. The noise lacked volume but possessed sufficient persistence to interrupt sleep. Groggily upright, I concentrated on identifying its source. It appeared to emanate from the window near the hearth. My initial hypothesis suggested arboreal branches swaying against glass panes. The surrounding forest grew densely, with numerous trees in close proximity to the structure. I mentally designated the issue for morning inspection and returned to sleep. The following day, I examined the cabin's perimeter. Several branches indeed extended sufficiently near to contact windows during windy conditions. I pruned them using gardening shears discovered in the storage shed. Problem resolved, or so I presumed. That evening, although the tapping ceased, something else manifested. While absorbed in literature beside glowing embers, I detected faint footfalls across the veranda. I reassured myself it represented wildlife, perhaps raccoon or deer wandering excessively close. Nevertheless, compulsion drove me to investigate. I cautiously opened the entrance, stepping onto the veranda with flashlight engaged. The luminous beam swept across wooden planking and into surrounding vegetation, revealing nothing unusual. I prepared to return indoors when something caught my attention at the porch's edge. A solitary mud-caked footprint. It appeared distinctly human, too small for ursine origin or other substantial wildlife indigenous to the region. Before processing this discovery fully, a powerful gust swept through the clearing, rustling foliage and sending shivers down my spine. I retreated inside, securing all entry points. The following morning, I returned to examine where I'd observed the footprint, but all evidence had vanished. Overnight winds and scattered leaves had erased any lingering impressions. I convinced myself I'd imagined it, yet discomfort lingered persistently. That evening, approximately 11:30 p.m., the tapping resumed. Louder this time, the sound migrated from the hearth-adjacent window toward the kitchen panes. I secured my flashlight, approaching the kitchen window with trepidation. Upon reaching it, hesitation seized me. Instinct counseled against investigation, yet curiosity's magnetism proved irresistible. I partially retracted the curtain, directing illumination outward. The beam captured the reflection of eyes staring directly back. two unblinking orbs suspended in darkness. I recoiled violently, accidentally dropping the flashlight. By the time I recovered and redirected the beam outside, the figure had vanished completely. I maintained vigil throughout remaining darkness, positioned beside the hearth, shotgun readily accessible. Hypervigilant to every auditory nuance, I perceived what sounded like subtle footsteps circling the structure, though visual confirmation remained elusive. Wind howled through surrounding timber, potentially masking additional sounds. Morning arrived, and I struggled to rationalize my nocturnal experience. Perhaps I'd observed deer, curious about interior illumination? Deep within, however, certainty persisted. This represented something entirely different. I resolved to abbreviate my sojourn, planning departure the subsequent day. On my final evening, the tapping returned, but evolved beyond mere tapping. Scratching accompanied it now, resembling fingernails dragging across glass surfaces. I remained immobilized in the fireside armchair, clutching the shotgun with white-knuckled intensity. Then I witnessed it, a silhouette outside the window, moving with deliberate slowness before halting directly before the glass pane. Firelight flickered, casting eerie patterns across the figure's features as it pressed closer against the transparent barrier. Summoning every fragment of courage, I raised the flashlight, directing its beam toward the window. The light illuminated a human visage, pallid and emotionless, staring directly into mine. For an eternal moment, neither of us moved. Then, as though startled by sudden illumination, the figure pivoted abruptly and disappeared into the forest's depths. I maintained armed vigilance throughout the night until dawn's first tentative rays penetrated the wilderness. Upon venturing outside, I discovered fresh footprints impressed in the soil, encircling the cabin before retreating back toward the forest. I contacted the property manager to report the incidents. His response proved infuriatingly dismissive. "Probably just a hiker," he suggested nonchalantly. "People frequently traverse those woodlands." "Traversing at midnight, observing me through windows?" I challenged incredulously. He shrugged indifferently. "They wander through, no cause for concern." I hastily gathered belongings and departed promptly, leaving behind the cabin and its unsettling surroundings forever. Yet that face framed in the window continues haunting me. Whoever they weren't merely passing through. They were observing, perhaps even waiting. It's a sensation I'll permanently carry, one impossible to discard completely. Fieldwork in the Alaskan wilderness defies predictability. You can meticulously plan for meteorological conditions, pack essential equipment, and precisely map your expedition route. But nature remains indifferent to human itineraries. That harsh reality confronted me as I trudged through the Kenai Peninsula's remote backcountry in September 2022, drenched to the marrow and desperately seeking shelter. I was monitoring a small population of coastal brown bears, documenting behavioral patterns for an extensive longitudinal study. Everything had progressed smoothly until a tempest materialized with savage swiftness. The precipitation arrived in violent sheets, transforming earthen trails into treacherous quagmires and reducing visibility to mere yards. Continuing seemed recklessly dangerous, especially with the terrain deteriorating rapidly. As I contemplated establishing an improvised camp, I glimpsed a shadowy silhouette through the coniferous barrier, the unmistakable angular outline of human construction. Squinting through the downpour, I realized I'd discovered a cabin. The structure appeared ancient, the type of dwelling that had witnessed generations pass. Its roof sagged precariously in the center, while verdant moss clung to the weathered timber walls like parasitic tapestry. Despite its dilapidated condition, it represented sanctuary, and at that moment, nothing else mattered. I pushed against the protesting door, concerned it might detach from its corroded hinges. Inside, the atmosphere hung stagnant, permeated with the pungent bouquet of mildew, decaying timber, and something metallic, almost ferrous. The furnishings were sparse, a crudely hewn table, several mismatched chairs, and a rudimentary cot positioned against the far wall. A thick layer of dust blanketed everything, except, curiously, for a distinct section of the table where someone had evidently sat recently. An unsettling realization dawned. This wasn't an abandoned relic. Someone actively utilized this space. Evidence of habitation manifested throughout. A partially consumed candle occupied the table's center, adjacent to a mug containing traces of liquid. My initial relief transformed gradually into apprehension. This wasn't merely a forgotten wilderness shelter. Someone frequented this cabin, and not particularly long ago. I debated immediate departure, but the tempest outside had intensified dramatically. Remaining seemed the safer option, so I convinced myself that whoever utilized the cabin wouldn't object to my temporary refuge. They might even be a fellow wildlife researcher using the structure as an observation post. As I explored the confined space, additional details emerged. Mud-encrusted boots arranged neatly beside the entrance mat, and more significantly, a journal resting on the table, its edges visibly worn and stained by elements. Curiosity overrode discretion. I opened the weathered volume. The initial pages contained what appeared to be journal entries, concise notations about meteorological conditions, hunting circumstances, and wildlife observations. But as I continued reading, the narrative tone shifted alarmingly. The entries began referencing people. Hiking party passed trailhead at 08:15, maintained concealment. Solitary camper established site near riverbed, observed departure approximately noon. Female in crimson jacket, unaccompanied, followed her to ridgeline. My stomach constricted involuntarily as I absorbed the content. These weren't casual observations. The descriptions possessed clinical precision, documenting arrival times, attire descriptions, and directional movements. The author wasn't merely observing. They were systematically tracking human subjects. I replaced the journal, hands trembling subtly. Outside, precipitation continued relentlessly, pounding against the roof and masking ambient sounds. I examined the boots again, their presence now seeming more ominous than reassuring. Then I noticed an additional detail, a cabinet door slightly ajar. Inside, I discovered preserved food containers and bottled water, but what captured my attention was a metal container filled with fresh cigarette remnants. Whoever utilized this cabin wasn't merely passing through. They actively resided here. I determined I couldn't remain. Regardless of weather conditions, I wouldn't await the return of whoever documented those disturbing surveillance notes. I hastily gathered my equipment, movements clumsy with nervous energy. As I prepared to depart, a sound paralyzed me, rustling, alarmingly proximate. I extinguished my flashlight immediately, plunging the space into darkness, heartbeat reverberating in my ears as I pressed against the wall, straining to detect further evidence of approach. The rustling intensified. I crept toward the window and peered through a fractured board. In the storm's diminished illumination, I discerned a figure moving deliberately among the trees. They didn't exhibit haste. Their movements appeared methodical, calculated. I couldn't distinguish facial features, but something about their physical bearing activated every primal warning system in my body. Then they halted abruptly, rotating toward the cabin. I retreated from view, pulse hammering against my ribcage. I waited, crouched beneath the window, as footsteps approached gradually. Then a voice penetrated the silence, deep, menacing, saturated with hostility. "Who's inside?" I remained motionless, my cognitive processes frantically analyzing available options. Fleeing meant exposure, but remaining felt equally perilous. The footfalls reached the porch, ancient boards groaning beneath transferring weight. "Emerge!" the voice demanded forcefully. "I know someone's present." I barely respirated as the doorknob rattled. The entrance resisted due to warped timber construction, but its resistance wouldn't endure indefinitely. I secured my backpack and maneuvered toward the rear window, prying it open with minimal noise. The entrance creaked ominously as the figure outside increased pressure against it. I slipped through the window aperture and dropped into the saturated earth, the deluge masking any sound accompanying my landing. Maintaining a low profile, I navigated toward the tree line. Upon reaching forest cover, I glanced backward. The cabin door now stood ajar, and I observed a silhouette occupying the threshold. They didn't pursue. Instead, they maintained stationary position, observing as I disappeared into the dense vegetation. I continued moving until establishing considerable distance. Upon finally reaching a ranger station the following morning, exhausted and operating on residual adrenaline, I reported everything: the cabin, the journal, the mysterious figure. "Sounds like you stumbled upon someone's hunting territory," one ranger commented indifferently. "Not uncommon in these regions." but their casual demeanor transformed immediately when I mentioned the surveillance notes documenting people. "You're indicating he tracked individuals?" the senior ranger inquired, leaning forward intently, his tone no longer casual. "Affirmative," I confirmed, voice wavering slightly. "Dates, physical descriptions, hiking routes, comprehensive documentation." The younger ranger exchanged significant glances with his colleague. "That's highly irregular. Most individuals here maintain appropriate boundaries. Monitoring hikers, though, that represents abnormal behavior." The senior ranger nodded, retrieving a topographical map from the counter. "Can you indicate this cabin's precise location?" I sketched the approximate coordinates, marking the trails I'd traversed. Both rangers promised immediate investigation. Their commitment provided marginal reassurance, knowing they weren't dismissing my account. "Your decision to report this demonstrates sound judgment," the senior ranger remarked as I prepared to depart. "We'll investigate thoroughly, but if you're prudent, avoid exploring remote cabins in this region. Not everyone occupying these territories adheres to conventional standards." I expressed appreciation and departed. I could only hope they'd discover something conclusive, because frankly, whatever transpired within that cabin, I wanted no further involvement. I never learned the observers' potential intentions. When I requested updates from rangers the following week, they reported finding the cabin abandoned upon inspection. The journal and supplies had vanished completely. I continue conducting fieldwork, but exercise substantially greater caution now. The wilderness possesses breathtaking beauty, but harbors unpredictable elements. And sometimes the most dangerous components aren't wildlife, but the humans you never observe approaching.